Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the podcast, I want to share with you a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago with my good friend Amy Fong, Vice President of Sourcing and Vendor Management at Everest Group. Amy has had a front row seat to procurement transformation as both a practitioner and an advisor, and she currently has a specific focus on services categories. Now, today's interview was actually recorded as part of a live event. I was invited by my friends at PASA, Procurement and Supply Australasia, to record a podcast live during their 9th annual PASA Premier Confex a couple of weeks ago. So in this conversation, Amy and I talked about how procurement can expand our value proposition before moving specifically into services-based categories. Categories that are hit particularly badly right now by the Great Resignation. One thing is for sure, managing on cost alone in these categories definitely no longer cuts it. So with that being said, let's go straight into the interview, again recorded live at PASA's Premier Confex. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
So procurement found me. I have a bit of a windy path into where I am today, but it makes sense, and I'll relate a little bit back to where we are today because I feel like I've been bringing up my starting point quite a bit. When I came out of college, I was in actually HR. Wanted to be a PhD in clinical neuropsych, but somehow ended up in HR for a little while, and then really liked business, ended up in a factory that was an outsourced packager of Gillette, working with razors, startup, fast moving, kind of figuring out that model with the people from Gillette. Went to school, decided I want to be in operations, and dating myself, I concentrated in operations, electronic B2B e-commerce, which was a thing then. It wasn't just and strategy. And then when I came out of school, wanted to do consulting. It was 2002, which was not a good time. That means there were a lot of layoffs. We're going through a really uncertain time, just like we are right now. I ended up working for HP for several years, managing their outsourced partners in APAC for manufacturing and design. And that was really my first role. That was a supply chain role, but as a partner business manager, it was really a bit of procurement, a bit of business, a bit of R&D. And I kind of grew that role into a couple different applications and then went into consulting where I did sourcing, strategy, supply chain, change management, all the things around that. At that point, I got acquired by the Hackett Group, and my consulting firm, Archstone, was acquired by Hackett Group, and moved over to the research side and was focused on procurement best practices. And that's probably the point in my career where I sort of chose a major, and it was sourcing. Yep. And before that, I don't think I thought of myself as a procurement person. But once you spend 10 years doing procurement best practices, you're a procurement person for life, maybe. So about 5.5 years ago, I left that role to go to where I am now at Everest Group. Still feel like I have a pretty good breadth from my experience as a practitioner, consultant, and advisor, but I think procurement definitely found me, and now I find myself kind of interweaving with procurement, sourcing, VMOs, vendor management, and a lot of other adjacent functions that all have to collaborate in the world now.
What from a category perspective now, because you're pretty targeted in terms of the types of firms that you're kind of covering and the areas of support that you're providing to Everest Group. Can you talk just a little bit about that to give some additional context?
Sure. Yeah. So Everest Group is an analyst firm. We've been around about 35 years, focused on global services, tech and tech services. So when you think about offshoring, when you think about outsourcing your BPO, tech and IT services, engineering services, consulting, those are the areas that the firm covers. We do a lot of, for sourcing teams, we provide a lot of market intelligence, and we provide a lot of commercial assurance, so price benchmarking, terms, negotiation strategy. As a firm, we're fairly focused on those strategic categories. It sounds like a narrow number of categories, but when you start to look at the spend of a lot of companies, it's huge. It's enormous spend. Right?
And the 100% the headcount too. Back in the day, I had a sourcing role managing outsourcing and offshoring for a financial services company,
Yeah.
and that was thousands of FTEs doing mortgage underwriting, for
Yeah.
example, in the Philippines.
Yeah. Tens
And
of
so
thousands.
it can be really extensive,
It
like
can
the
be.
level
And
of
I think for
spend.
most companies, their workforce, a lot of companies, their workforce is kind of a third outsourced, a third in-house, and maybe a third contingent. And we
Hmm.
cover those two thirds. What my team does specifically, though, I have a team of people that are procurement focused, right? So they are looking at, all right, what kind of skills do you need to manage those categories? What are the capabilities? What's the procured tech that you need in your
Yeah.
stack? So I kind of approach from two ways. One is, how do you really become a great category manager or vendor manager for the categories that we cover? Because again, huge contracts,
Yeah.
$500 million contracts in some cases. And also, how do you as a category manager and procurement team get smart at all of the tech and services that your company is buying? Because you can't just look at what you do in procurement.
Yeah.
The market intelligence, the pricing assurance is really for all of those categories. So it's a little bit of inside procurement. It's a little bit of the broader industry. I had touched that industry before, but in the last 5.5 years, I've gotten a lot deeper into
Mhm.
it, and we can talk more about it. But it's at a really interesting point right now, so that's exciting.
Yeah, we're recording this in early to mid-April,
Yeah,
and
time
I'd love to kind of take the macro, and then let's talk a little bit more about category specific. Obviously tariffs are all around us, all discussions of what's going on. The unknown, I think, is as much a fear of the tariffs themselves. We were talking actually a little bit off mic about the fact that you're really in a space that is, it's services, it's not moving things around, it's not direct materials. But are you still seeing an impact on services or the clients that you support from, the unknown around the tariff situation right now?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely are. I mean, there's the part that we all see as, especially as Americans, right? But anybody who's got a 401k feels that, and the uncertainty of our companies and spend and all that. But the things that we see are, one, we cover the service provider market. And if your service providers are growing, if they're shrinking, where their margins are, all of their financials actually play a pretty big role in how you can negotiate your pricing
Mm-hmm.
and contract with them, and the terms. When we were in a talent shortage, what does that mean for your contracting? When we were seeing, really high turnover, when you're seeing them focus on growth instead of margins, like what does that mean in a negotiation, right? So right now, where we see there, we just our market insights team just scaled back the growth targets
Mm-hmm.
forecast for the service provider market and said, we thought it was at whatever, let's say 5% off the top of my head.
Yeah.
There's three scenarios, they're all lower, right? So what does that mean now? We thought the buyer's market was ending. Maybe you got a little bit more negotiating power as a
Mm-hmm.
buyer. So translating those financials, which we have teams that are covering those financials, into what does that mean to me, which, maybe there's terms like cost of living adjustment, COLA, that are built in, that are, that actually was really popular 5 years ago, a little bit less popular
Yeah.
now. That goes in and out of style every couple of years. If you're building a long-term contract, what terms can you negotiate and what you can't use? So that's one area. The other is this, we work with all industries, so I don't want to exclude anyone. A lot of big companies, but when you look at industries like pharma, med device, insurance, financial
Mm-hmm.
services, banking, they're impacted, some of them directly. Obviously, your pharma ingredients, your med device components that are coming in, high tech materials, and all of that is a direct impact from tariffs. But if you think of like an insurance company or a bank, they're impacted by the uncertainty in the market. They're also impacted by parts costs for, let's say, you're covering property and
Yeah,
casualty, right?
replacement value of things
Those
that you've insured.
windshields,
Yeah.
yeah, the windshields going back and forth the border between the U.S. and Canada, like that's one of my clients was asking me, he's like, we're modeling it out because we have a huge amount of spend in windshields, and this is going to be impactful, and of course that's going to impact your insurance and premiums, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to impact all of their costs. Same with things like construction materials. So some of the industries that you would think, oh, like it's not really impacting them, it is. We don't cover those material costs, so we're not as focused on forecasting the cost structure impacts. I do think that everyone should be doing that, and I will advise them on tools to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But what we are focused really on is, if you have 70% of your spend with these providers and their market is changing, how is your situation going to change? Do you need to look at moving services? Because we cover a lot of cloud and software as well, tech, anything that happens there. There's some talk of things happening from Europe
Mhm.
around taxes on services in cloud and stuff like that. Data center costs, all of that will be indirectly impacting what we do.
What are some of the, you said it's an exciting time in the kind of business services world at the moment. What are some of the kind of the major points of discussion within that category, or interest, or, coming to terms with the pace of change? Like what's
Yeah.
top of agenda?
Yeah. So I think the most exciting thing that we're talking about right now is the impact Gen AI has on the delivery
Mhm.
of business services across the enterprise, right? And we think of this in procurement, we tend to talk a lot about Gen AI in procurement and agentic in procurement, and we're covering that. My team covers procure tech too. But when you look at what it's doing to the enterprise, that is fascinating. And when you look at how you're going to work with service providers, contract with them, hold them, manage your vendors, how you're going to, structure a contract now for something that's a 5-year agreement that the world is going to change and the way they
Mhm.
deliver is going to change. There's so much to think about there. We're early on in that. We do have forecasts of where the costs are being, where you're paying now and where you're saving later in your contracts. But the service providers are all working to bring that Gen AI. So when you look at like how IT services is delivered, I mean, it's going to completely change. So as a firm, we're calling that shift systems of action, right? We're moving from systems of record, systems of
Mhm.
engagement to systems of action. And we think it's going to be the biggest shift since labor arbitrage. And you were around in the labor
Yeah,
arbitrage days, right?
very, very close to, I lived in India delivering shared service center in those days
Yeah.
in the labor arbitrage kind of rush.
Yeah. And there's still companies, I work with some clients that are less mature in that space that are still on that labor arbitrage sugar high, right? But for the most part, most of services has shifted to be more about accessing talent, technology. There's so much that as a major enterprise you need to be doing, either in IT or in your services that's tech enabled that you just don't want to build in house. So, outsourced partners are really the ones that deliver that to you. Now, as their business model shifts, how do you shift as a sourcing team?
Yeah. So if services firms are using AI in the delivery of services to you, how much should you care about that? Like, how is
Yeah.
that something that's happening behind the scenes, that those, the suppliers are trying to, not necessarily trying to hide, but they're not saying we're using AI in these ways because it's an efficiency play for them? Or is there transparency in terms of, this is the human element, this is the AI element?
Yeah, I think at this point, because it's mostly in pilot to production mode, it's
Mhm.
pretty transparent. I haven't heard of situations where providers are hiding it in a way they're marketing it, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to be the one that's the most Gen AI,
Right.
the most agentic, right? I think there's questions though. One is the one that I posed earlier of like, okay, as that shifts, I know now that we expect them to need 30% fewer headcounts to do the
Right.
work. How does that change our cost structure?
It's
The
it's
other
funny. I just
question,
wrote that down as a question for you. It's like, if you're
yeah,
using agentic, then what's that doing to your price?
yeah. I mean, it is. It should change your cost structure,
Yeah.
and you have to decide. You have to work out with them, and the market will dictate. Obviously, these are all market driven, so
Yeah.
all of our benchmarking is off of real data. It's not survey based. It's not sentiment. It is like we looked at 1,000 contracts, and these are the terms that are most
Mhm.
popular type thing. And here's the median and the 80th and 20th percentile for this rates or for a managed services agreement. So the market will dictate where that goes. We're seeing some trends right now in how that's getting factored in. My my I think the observation right now is that the cost is up and not down for the
Okay.
providers because they're still investing. There's so many pilots. They're not seeing really reaping the benefits yet. We're starting to get to that, but it's early stage. We saw last year so many pilots that the sentiment of providers was like, look, no more free pilots. Like it
Yeah.
used to be that you'll do a pilot on
Yeah.
anything just to get customers, but it was getting a little out of hand, and I started to see some of that vibe from the market. Our data showed that at least 75% of pilots did not go into production. So that's a
Mhm.
lot of energy wasted, or, I mean, not wasted, you learn from it, but it's a
Yeah.
lot of trial and error. I've seen other data, depending on who you ask, where only like 2 or 3% go to production. So depends who, the enterprise is saying 75%. I think the
Yeah.
providers are like, man, 3%.
Um,
3% don't make it.
I mean,
Um,
there's a lot of experimentation, and I think
it
that's
is.
part of kind of the journey because we none of us really know where the journey ends. But
It's totally the journey. Yeah.
do you see like common causes of pilots that make it to production versus those that don't?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to dig a little deeper into it. I really think a lot of it is just throwing it against the wall and figuring
Yeah.
out what needs a human touch, how much can we automate here. Things that I think pilots that didn't make it in production might come back in a year or two and make more
Hmm.
sense.
It's a bit
So the
early.
things like the trial and error and the
Yeah.
ordering of what you want, you can't do everything at once. Like none of us, we're in a state of rapid change right now, and no one can do everything at once. So being cautious in how much we try to do so we do it well. I think that's a little bit of the prioritization as well, but that's my perspective.
Do you feel that like the change management will be the roadblock, if you will, for pace of change versus how the underlying technology can drive change? Like we can do a lot, but we're at the end of the day we're dealing with big enterprises,
Yeah,
and they don't necessarily adopt because they can't adopt at the scale that we're seeing of change right now.
yeah. I think that's going. I think we're going to see more and more of that. It's the people, and as much as we would, I sometimes joke like it's easier for me to train agents than it is to train,
Mhm.
400 analysts to do what I want them to
Yeah.
do. To say something the way I want them to say it, I can just get my GPT to do that, like clean up into the sourcing
Yeah.
frames or whatever, into my language. And I love our analysts; they're super smart. But that's one of those situations. Like sometimes automating something is just a lot easier than
Mhm.
people, right? Changing behaviors. That said, I think we know, and I will always say that the people are what are not coming out of the system. The people need to be doing the strategic thinking work. That's an important part, and you need to bring them along for the ride. I mentioned I did a lot of change management work early in my
Yeah.
career, and I think that still comes back all the time. I think a little of it is the change management. So in my space, a little of it is the change management within the enterprise, the buyer, right? A lot of it is the change management within the service provider business. And those providers, in some cases, are much better at rapidly
Yeah.
handling change management because they're set up for it. It's their core business.
What's fascinating to me for the service provider side is that they could look at, especially under previously FTE driven models, they can look at AI and agentic AI as being a threat to their business model, and so try and resist the pace of change, maybe take a while for them to come to terms with the change that is heading their way. But on the other hand, as you say, they're kind of marketing that they have this capability, because if you don't, then you look like you're going to get left behind. So it's
Yeah,
kind of a
yeah.
difficult balance from them. They've got to kind of embrace it, but there must be this fear that their business and delivery models are going to have to change because of it.
That's true, and it's really interesting. I generally see them leaning in. I got a question from a client who's at a large telecom, and it's a sourcing leader, IT sourcing leader, and he's like, "Look, I need to I've squeezed the juice out of my negotiation cost savings with
Yeah.
these IT tech, services provider. I need to figure out how we will use or they will use technology to reduce what we spend with them over the next
Mhm.
5 years. But I don't think that they're going to come to me with that. I don't think they're going to come to me and say, this is how we're going to save. So, what are the things I need to hold them to? And that is a bit less of the interesting thing is when I think about, all right, which analysts really know this part and can help them. That's a lot of what I'm doing. Like, let me
Mhm.
match you up with the right expert, right? This is not a pricing commercial thing. This is a tech thing. How do I make sure that the providers we use are implementing the right tech and we're capturing the right value from it and results, right? And then how do I actually measure them and hold them to that? At the same time, last week at one of our events in London, we had a roundtable that was supposed to be about tech and vendor management. What we really, what everybody was really focused on was, yeah, as this changes, like how does my VMO need to change in my
Mhm.
performance metrics for these vendors? Because if they are using 50% agents instead of people, like half my metrics are like, what do my new OKRs look like,
Yeah.
right? Massive change in thinking, massive change in the way that we source, select, manage vendors, negotiate, all of that. So it's an exciting time. Happy to be like kind of in the middle of that and have lots of smart people to brainstorm with.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's a trend, therefore, to go from, buying outputs, or, we buy transactions or we buy people versus what are the outcomes that they're driving? So you don't necessarily care about how they deliver, but, but what the outcomes they deliver have a certain monetary value that you're willing to pay a certain amount of money for. And you're kind
Yeah.
of doing that exchange rather than an output. Do you see moves towards that kind of contract structure?
Definitely. Yeah. So we've been talking about outcome-based contracts for a while now, and everybody theoretically agrees, right? So just to put some definitions out there for the audience, you kind of have your input-based contracts that might be time and materials. You might have output-based contracts that are kind of like, per invoice handling in
Yeah.
P2P, right? Or per call in contact center, or per team or whatever that might be, or per story point.
Yeah.
So, if you're doing an agile contract, you might have per story point type pricing, right? And those kind of more input output based models become pretty ubiquitous. You also have managed services where you're just like handle this scope of work and get it done, and that's a little bit less hands-on. Great reasons. There's places you should use each of those. There's lots of different contract constructs. When we talk about outcome based, it's really looking at the business results. It's a step removed from that. And that can make sense in some places if you're looking at contact center and you're looking at like customer sat, CSAT type metrics, right? You can kind of agree on a baseline. When you get to other areas, everybody agrees this is something we want. It's really hard to implement it. So when I've looked at some of the data we've seen when we look at contract negotiations, again, we're looking at like thousands of contracts. We see 95% of RFPs are, make this outcome based or include some outcome based metrics.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, it's something like 4 to 5% that actually end up with it, right?
So
and
the
you
desire is there,
funnel, right?
the desire, but not necessarily the execution. Or it's not necessarily just the execution. It's a whole different way of doing business, isn't it?
It is. And as a sourcing person, there's a graphic that I love that's like this funnel through the 95 and all the reasons, right? And being someone who's been on both sides of the table, like I completely understand every one of those reasons because it's both sides. Like, and a lot of it is internal to the buyer. So how comfortable are you with the baseline? Are your stakeholders really bought into this outcome-based thing? And if they are, is sourcing really bought in?
Mm-hmm.
As in my consulting days, like doing sourcing work, we always liked the idea of gain sharing, like getting paid based on the savings. But
until the gain is too high.
Until you do a good job and your client resents you for having to pay you more, right? So it's like one of those things that, even like different partners.
It's good up to a certain level, but don't you succeed even more, then you're going to be back at the table negotiating.
Exactly. They're like, well, I didn't want to pay you that much, but we did better. So it's there's just so much like internally and on the buy side and the sell side that makes it really hard to put those in place. Now we do see them getting used in many situations. We've got a lot of case studies where we see outcome-based measurement and OKRs kind of being built in, and I think that is the direction. It just seems to be one of those things that like every conference there's a workshop on it because nobody really finds it easy to do yet. Right?
We were talking again before we hit record. You've been on the road quite a bit the last couple of weeks at events. What's the word on the street, that you're hearing in terms of the topics that are really top of mind for, when we're kind of contextualized around, but essentially buying services?
Yeah. So I think some of the things that we've seen, and I see this a lot in the events that we've done, the roundtables that I've kind of facilitated in different places. I love a roundtable with CPOs where they're talking about their problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just keeping it moving. Some of the really interesting trends, I'm going to go before this last 2 weeks because it's been a roller coaster. We talked about that. Are thinking about, I had one situation where one roundtable discussion where CPOs were talking about, we want to talk about talent and training for procurement, and we want to talk about Gen AI. And then somebody said, I don't know how you can talk about those separately. You have to have a Gen AI strategy for what you're doing, and you have to think about how that impacts your talent. And I was like, fair point, right? So the overlap of those, I think where I see is a lot of more overlap in topics and in groups. A big theme that I picked up from our Engage event last fall was that this whole topic of, offshoring, outsourcing, sourcing tends to think of this as a buying thing, right? It's a
Hmm.
sourcing problem, it's spend. But there's a whole other part of our coverage that works with GBS organizations, the internal offshore, nearshore, global capability centers, global
Yeah.
business services. There's a ton of that. A lot of companies are either putting more centers that are captive, as we
Yeah.
use the word, overseas, or they're actually insourcing and shifting some of their outsourced spend into their own
Yeah. They're
centers.
bringing it back home
Yeah,
to
yeah.
their
So
own
they have a little
centers.
more control.
Yeah.
What I really found is that the people who are leaders in this, the companies that are leaders in this, they're doing both. They're looking at it as workforce strategy, and they're looking at having a hybrid model where they can shift really quickly between internal and external, maybe based on project,
Yeah.
right? So, here we're working, our functional, our business stakeholder needs this project. Where do we want to have that done? Does it make sense to do in-house? Does it make sense to do outside? Different locations. It's a more agile way of thinking versus like I'm going to put finance and accounting outsourced in Hyderabad and it's going to be there for 5 years. Like nothing lasts 5 years. So you need to have a model where you can shift back and forth on the fly. It's a little bit like what we're seeing in the supply chain right now with tariffs, where everybody's like, how do I have multiple places so I can
Right.
move things around?
Agility and
Yeah,
flexibility.
yeah, and so that agility with the people part of it, as well as infusing technology, I think that sourcing needs to be thinking not just about the providers, but they need to be partnering. The companies that I see do that well tend to be like insurance, where they put tech and ops under the same leaders, and they said, think about your GCC, your Global Capability Center, as well as your outsourced partners, and the strategy for that. They are probably not actually sourcing people because sourcing doesn't think this way.
And that was kind of a follow up because one, I'm interested to hear that kind of the hybrid movement is growing steam, because I've just been a long time believer in hybrid models in terms of operating models and how you can get
Mm-hmm.
kind of flexibility, expertise, and everything, in a single kind of model. But procurement should be in the make or buy conversation, and
Yeah,
yet,
yeah.
very rarely are we in that conversation. So I wonder, as you've observed, if you've observed organizations where procurement has been in part of make or buy, what has given them, the ability to earn that, and I hate to use seat at the table, but
Yeah.
kind of seat at the table in those
It
discussions.
is a seat at the table, though. It really is. So we do a lot of that. I have a peer who works with GBS, and the content, the conversations now are so overlapping. I think that the companies that do that well, or the procurement teams that do that well, they understand that it's a make or buy. They understand that there is probably a combination that's the right answer. So
Mhm.
to have an in-house center, you do want to have some scale, and you want to think about where you're outsourcing to get the technology, the talent, some of the things I mentioned earlier that don't make sense. Like we're not a big brand. We're not going to attract 3,000 employees in India,
Yeah,
right? Like sometimes there are others that can do that better. There are also models like build, operate, transfer,
yeah.
bot, as we call it, that kind of went away for a while and just came back. And
It's
they're
funny you say that. Like, I haven't heard that term for,
under
that was all
bot.
the rage, when 20
Exactly.
years ago almost, when I was in India, and I
Yeah,
haven't
so
heard it
we
forever.
we refreshed a paper like 2 years ago because
Mhm.
everybody's doing a bot build. That just for the listeners again who aren't deep into the details here. Build, operate, transfer means basically we want to have our own center in another country, or maybe it's in the US, or maybe it's near shore in Canada, and we're going to partner with a provider to actually start it up, build it, hire the talent, build all the infrastructure, and then they'll transfer it back to us in time. Sometimes that's like a 5-year plan. Sometimes it's shorter. There's a bunch of different models. There's probably 5 or 6 different models that we cover that we see happening pretty regularly. But it's what seems like an easier way, more controlled way to do it. And then I think in a lot of cases it makes sense. I also sometimes think that you don't end up taking it back in house,
No,
right?
it's
But a
it
lot
kind
of
of
times you do.
it kind of enables a conversation around should we be outsourcing this or not, to go ahead and do
Yeah,
it. And
yeah,
then, you never actually get round to, you realize the magnitude that is involved in managing it yourself. And so
yeah.
it becomes easier to leave where it is.
Exactly. Yeah, I've seen that. I've heard from providers that they just did 25 bots, and only 3 of them have gone back in house yet. And I'm like,
Mhm.
really interesting, because it's actually a lot more expensive to do a build, operate,
Yeah.
transfer contract or project than to just outsource it,
Yeah,
right?
because you're buying the IP essentially as well,
Yeah,
aren't you? Like
imagine the
knowledge goes into it.
contracting alone, right? The negotiations alone and all the things. That said, I think there's a lot of really good uses for using a provider to set up your captive, right? So
Mhm.
so I think your question, though, getting back at what makes a sourcing team really have that seat at the table, to use that phrase, right? I'm a big believer in market intelligence. I was a big believer
Yeah.
after my Hackett days of best practices and category management. I came to Everest Group because I was like, there's this huge spend area, and sourcing doesn't know what they don't know in it. So that is a lot of what we do, right? We're educating on who are the providers, what are the locations you can be looking at, what are the levers you can pull, and it's not just pricing; it's understanding the market and it's understanding the commercials, right? So being able to say, somebody asked me yesterday, hey, I know pretty well my providers and what they can do,
Mhm.
but I don't know my blind spots. I
Yeah.
don't know what else others can do. Are there specialists we should be using to do this? What are the expectations? What's the bar? Where should our bar be? Right? Bringing that knowledge to your stakeholders is what gets you that
Yeah.
seat, right? So I've
Yeah.
always been a big believer, like, if you want to earn your spot, you need to have category managers who are well versed, who can have the conversation and bring new information.
Yeah.
And so we work with, like, within our memberships, my philosophy is kind of a more the merrier. There are some analyst firms that are like, everybody needs a seat and a license. And if you don't have a license, you can't be on this call, this inquiry
Mhm.
call. I don't directly try to compete with them, but often they're brought up in our conversations. Like, it's nice when you don't have to talk about your
Yeah.
competitor, right?
Yeah.
We license by function. So we say, all right, everybody in sourcing and vendor management has access. If you
Yeah.
want to bring your IT stakeholder or your finance leader to a call, that's great. We want to have that conversation. We're high engagement, high value engagement. So our analysts are actually encouraged to be in conversations, talking to clients, adding value, not just like doing a one to many session, but having a conversation and
Mhm.
influencing decisions. And that's kind of our corporate motto. So it's a very different, as an analyst, a very different way of enabling businesses to, enabling
Yeah.
sourcing.
You're more tied to outcomes that are ultimately driven.
Definitely tied to their outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm such a big believer in procurement has to show up with insights and data that the business don't have themselves, or an interpretation of data in a way that drives different decisions that would have been made without it. Because if we
Yeah.
don't show up to do that, then we're just running transactions for people,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you have to kind of earn that right to play in some of those big, because those make buy conversations are big strategic conversations.
Yeah, they are big strategic conversations. And I mean, these are billion-dollar
Yeah.
decisions that someone at a very senior level is making, and you want to be the one helping them make them. And you want to have your assumptions challenged and be given in, be bringing in things that are new, right? We were briefing a client the other day, and they said, well, this was our perspective, and it doesn't match what you're saying. And he's like, I know you're just giving us the data. I'm like, no, we're not. Let's
Mhm.
talk about why it's not matching. Like,
Yeah.
let's have that difficult conversation, because you can have it with an analyst, and then, and their whole sourcing team was on the call, but, you're having that difficult conversation with us. Now you're going to be more prepared to have that difficult conversation with
Mhm.
your stakeholder and maybe challenge internal thinking. And if you want to, put a report in front of them, or a chart, or you want to get them on the phone with us, like, we're not telling you what to do, I'm not telling you what to make the decision, it's your decision, but rationale behind it based on what others are doing in the market, it's important to know all those
Yeah.
sides.
Well, Amy, I know it's about time for us to wrap up.
We
So
can
I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's been too long since we've recorded anything. For anybody who'd like to first reach out, get in touch with you, what's the easiest way for them to do that?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Amy Fong, Amy M. Fong, I think. Pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. And that's the easiest place to reach out, and you can find me from there.
Yeah, and also you have an event in September in Dallas, I
We
believe,
do.
where folks can come and meet you face to face if
We
they want
do. So
more
we have
about.
our Everest Group Engage. Engage is not an accident. It's meant to be a pun. I
Mhm.
mentioned high engagement. Our events are meant to be high engagement. Yeah, it's September 8th through 10th, I believe. I'll put that in the show notes if you're willing to. Really focused on sourcing leaders, VMOs, GBS, IT, tech leaders. Bring your stakeholder, bring your CPO, And I'm very excited building the agenda right now. And last time, this is our second round. We got great speakers, analyst workshops, things like these pricing. Everything we talked about today will be on the stage there and also in interactive formats so people can meet their peers, meet an analyst. I love the format. Super excited about these events. I have a discount code for our AOP friends, so we'll put
Awesome.
that in the show notes.
We will do. And it's September 8th to the 10th. It's in
Yeah.
Dallas. Renaissance Dallas Hotel. Yeah, we'll put all the details in the show notes. Those will be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. It's artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll just be able to find this conversation with Amy and I. Anyone who from the AOP community would like to join, we'll pop that discount code in those show notes as well.
Yeah, appreciate that.
All right. Well, until next time, Amy, I want to thank you for sharing your insights, spending your time with us, and just appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Phil. Great to catch up.
All right. Thank you very much, Amy.
Take care.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.